Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblett. This podcast is listener supported. If you would like to support this podcast, consider signing up on my Patreon, where you get early access to the episodes and also access to some exclusive interviews centered around success. It's a little series I started called Steps to Success. Also, if you want to join in on the Telegram group chat, you can join in on the discussion of the podcast episode topics with other strong Stoics. My articles you can find on Medium and the Stoic Gym magazine. Finally, my newsletter you can sign up for on Substack. Thank you to everyone who is already supporting/subscribing to this podcast. I appreciate you guys. Today I have the absolute privilege of speaking with Tanner Campbell. Tanner is the founder of Practical Philosophy and the host of the Practical Stoicism podcast. He's currently working on what is, in my opinion, a very noble goal, a platform for academics to independently share their wisdom with those willing to hear it. He has also authored a book called Practical Stoicism and has another book coming out called Stoicism But Brief. Coming up very soon. Stay tuned for that. In this episode, Tanner and I talk about Stoicism, of course, but in the context of the Western world. Stoicism is a Western philosophy by definition, but how could it be that our current value system in the West is so misaligned with virtue ethics? I really enjoyed chatting with Tanner, and our conversation took many surprising yet interesting twists and turns. Without further ado, please welcome Tanner Campbell. I'm happy you're here. I'm excited to chat with you, man. So thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Your podcast kind of took the world by storm. The practical, what's the official name? Practical Stoicism, right?
Yeah, Practical. I think by storm is a little too generous, but thank you. It is the second most popular Stoicism podcast, but in the world of podcasting, I think Stoicism in general might be the least listened to subject matter, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, probably. I got to ask you, why Stoicism? Just a general question, I guess, just to get us started here. But I'll leave that open ended. You can answer it for you personally, which I'd love to hear. But the answer might be the same. But even just in general, why Stoicism?
Why Stoicism for me, or why Stoicism for the podcast?
I would say for you personally, but clearly, I think this is something that you highly value and you think would be valuable if more people were to engage in it. So I guess two different questions, but sort of the same question in some ways.
So for myself, I came across Stoicism in 2013 or 14, somewhere thereabouts. And I remember when I approached it, I was a pretty hardcore atheist at the time. I still consider myself to be an atheist, just not as, let's say, devout. Ironically, I'll use that word. Not as devout an atheist as I used to be. And I was put off by some of the God talk in it. And so I kept it at a little bit of a distance, but it was really difficult for me not to recognize that there was a lot of really good advice that came out of Stoicism. And specifically, I'm talking about Marcus Aurelius. He was my first exposure to Stoicism, as I think he is the first exposure for most people who come to Stoicism not knowing anything about it. It's usually through Marcus and his meditations. And I kept it at a distance for a couple of years until I read a book by Sharon Lebel. It's called The Art of Living. It's her interpretation of Epictetus's Handbook and Enchiridion. And after having read that, I thought, okay, there's so much more to this philosophy that is clearly useful beyond just the ethical parts of the philosophy. And even some of the ethical parts that I was keeping at a distance because I couldn't stand the providence talk or the God talk, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, okay, well, I can get over the fact that this might be a little bit uncomfortable for me so that I can get more value out of this. I can still be an atheist, no big deal, right? That was kind of my thinking at the time. But I think I'm really selling Stoicism short, not giving myself a fair shot to be improved by it. If I really make this about, oh, I can't read this because I'm too atheistic to read it, it was obvious I needed to delve more into it. And right at about the same time I made the decision, my life experienced some change that I don't think is necessary to go into, but another couple of years passed before I delved more seriously into it. And that happened because in 2019, 2020, I experienced some personal tragedies, in the financial sense and in the living situation sense. And I remember after coming out of the other side of those things, I'm kind of far from my Stoic practice at the moment. I'm not back to. I need to get back to it. And that was the preface of the podcast was, well, a really good way to make sure that I'm talking about Stoicism all the time and focusing on Stoicism all the time is to have a podcast that I promise people I will be talking about Stoicism all the time with. So started the podcast, and very much by happenstance, totally unintentionally, it became as popular as it has become. And then I had a responsibility on my hands more than I thought I was signing on to. And so with that, I came to the realization myself that, yeah, I have been engaging with Stoicism for years, but if I'm going to be this, let's say, figurehead to some extent within the Stoic community, I can't have my knowledge of the philosophy be as shallow as it is currently. That's what I thought to myself. And this is only going back maybe like 8 months at this point. And so I applied to the College of Stoic Philosophers. I started reading more deeply. I brought on a couple of mentors. Kai Whiting is one of those mentors. I dove deeper into the philosophy than I ever had before. And that has allowed me to create a podcast that I think resonates with people because I'm a high school dropout myself. And so I don't tend to speak in really overly eloquent words, which I think makes me very accessible when compared to other people who try to quote unquote wax philosophical on the philosophy. And that was not an intentional thing. It's just the way I speak. And so I think I have a unique ability in the quote unquote landscape of Stoicism entertainment, if that's what we're calling this, and information to convey complex ideas and concepts in plain language that isn't condescending or confusing to people.
I love that, man. And it reminds me of something that we say in engineering. And it's not just in engineering, but if you have a concept, you should be able to explain it to a 5-year-old. And that's not to be that's not meant to make you feel superior to other people, but that has real practical applications in the real world because if you're, say, the lead of a team, you have to accept that the chances of people that report to you not having as complete or as full of an understanding of certain things as you do, you have to kind of understand that and accept that. And so it's not that you're dumbing down, that's a bad way of putting it, but people have different perspectives, different strengths, different weaknesses. And so you have to be able to kind of make that applicable to everybody. And I think if you can't explain a concept simply, you probably don't have a thorough grasp on it. And so I love that about you. And I also, the whole thing about the responsibility that you have on yourself to have, you're basically setting high expectations for yourself. And I know you feel like that's a crowd thing that your audience is demanding of you, but I think it's very humbling and noble to see that. I think ultimately that comes from you. I mean, you're demanding quality for yourself, and I try and do the same, even though I'm sure I fall short. One of the things I wanted to really delve into in terms of stoicism with you is really how you and I, last time we spoke, we had some criticisms of some of the modern values you're in the US, I'm in Canada, and we see this kind of manifested in not just the younger generation, I mean all the generations now. But after our conversation, it I got thinking about this because it was interesting. Stoicism is a Western philosophy at the end of the day, and you could argue that much of our world has sort of built out of the foundations of that. And so it was curious to me why you and I were so passionate about Stoicism, yet we had a bit of criticism for sort of our current modern Western world and the values of that. So I was hoping maybe between us we could hash out where some of that uh, where the overlap is and where it's not. So what's your first thoughts on that problem or that idea?
My first thoughts are going to be that, geez, there's a lot of places to start on that. Okay, let's just plant our flag and go from there. I will start with the idea that philosophy, uh, modern philosophy, contemporary philosophy, seems to be rooted in rights based ethics frameworks. Whereas Stoicism is a virtue ethics framework-based philosophy. So in Stoicism, virtue is the only good. It's not a good, it's not the highest good, it's the only good. Now, Stoicism is a little bit, in order to convey complex ideas, one has to be very specific with one's language, right? That's it. It becomes impossible to explain anything complicated if at the outset you don't explain what your words mean when you use them. Because the Stoics don't use the word good in the same way that you or I might use the word good to say, that dinner I had last night was good. And the Stoics understood that there was, it was as weird to say that virtue was the only good in 300 BCE when Zeno said it, as it is today. It's really strange to walk up to someone and say the only good is virtue. People would be like, "Well, what about ice cream? That's pretty good." I would agree. I didn't get
I
these
would
two
agree
chins
too.
for nothing, baby. Ice cream's great. But when Stoics say good, what they mean is virtue is so important. A good character is so important. A virtuous character is so important that it should be the only good. Everything else is an indifferent. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions in Stoicism is we say something like slavery is an indifferent. And I'm picking an extreme intentionally because it sounds insane that I would say something like that, right? Because of course slavery is bad in the non-Stoic sense of the word bad. But Stoics also say the only bad is vice. And they define when they use good or bad, what they're talking about is, and I'll get back to the slavery comment. I'm not going to glaze over it. I know it's probably just other people are like, what did he just say? What kind of podcast is this? When they say something is good or bad, what they mean is whether or not that good thing, whether or not that thing has any ability to impact our ability as individuals to develop virtue. So virtue is the only good, meaning if something is good, it is virtuous, or it helps you to develop virtue. And if it's bad, it's vice. And the only thing that's really vicious to the Stoics is something that can take away from our ability to build virtue. And so when they call everything else an indifferent, what they're really saying isn't that those things don't matter, right? Of course, slavery matters. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. Nobody with a half a brain in their head wants that. When they say it's an indifferent, they mean it doesn't have an ability to impact our character. So as an example, pretty well-known fact that Epictetus was a slave, and being a slave did not prevent Epictetus from being a virtuous person. And so then slavery is not bad in the Stoic sense. Remember, definitions are very specific here. In the Stoic sense, it's not bad. It is a dispreferred indifferent, an indifferent that we would prefer not to have. But if we do, well, I guess we've got it. And we can still build a virtuous character in spite of it. The same thing goes for anything that's good, like wealth. Wealth is an indifferent because wealth could, hypothetically, could help you to do more virtuous things. It would be virtuous to bring a homeless person off the street and give them a life and pay for their clothes and give them a home and find them a job. So wealth might help you do something like that. So we call it a preferred indifferent, but ultimately being wealthy does not enable you to be virtuous just because you're wealthy. I mean, think of all the rich people that you've ever seen on the news being spoken not positively about. You can be rich and you can struggle with obsession with cars, overspending, gluttonous behavior. So there are challenges when you're a slave that face you as to how more or less difficult the road to virtue might be. And there are also challenges when you're rich that exist as well. So indifference are things that we have to allow to impact us either way. So we make a decision in our own minds whether or not we're going to let our poor circumstances or our terrific external circumstances hurt us or hinder us. But since they can't actually hurt or hinder us directly, they're called by the Stoics indifference.
Right. Yeah, that was a great explanation of the indifferent idea. Uh, I often think of Stoicism as s- s- something that sounds defeatist in some ways. If from the outset, let's say, from looking at it from afar, it's this idea that you talked about of like ownership. That's the word I would put on it. This extreme ownership of everything. And I tell myself this a lot as, let's say, an aspiring Stoic, is that in many ways kind of tells you no excuses, man. Like, you get upset about something, Stoics would say, no excuses. Take responsibility, take agency over what you can control. It's going to be things you can't, but that doesn't mean that you can't look at it in the right way and get over that idea. So I think that's anyways, that was a great explanation for indifference, and I think that whole no excuses thing. I think that ties in. I'm curious if you think about it like that as well. I mean, this is something I naturally gravitate towards. This idea, you think, oh, this guy at work is doing this for me, and you think, well, actually, did you do everything that you could have possibly done to make that a better situation? Did you communicate properly? Did you X? Did you Y? And that extreme ownership, it can come off as a bit, again, like I mentioned, defeatist, but I think it's really empowering for me now. And I'm curious if you think about this in terms of stoicism and these excuses that always come up in our heads about why this isn't right or why we don't do things a certain way or why the outcome isn't what we expect. I don't know. Does that enter your mind at all?
Yeah, of course. It's hard to look at any individual aspect of Stoicism on its own because all of it, the physics, the logic, the ethics, which is mostly what people talk about nowadays, is the ethical part of it, and what you're talking about is called contemporarily is called the dichotomy of control. Nobody really called it that in ancient times. I kind of get a giggle when people say things like premeditatio malorum, or all the other Latin phrases, which are very clearly not Greek phrases, and
Right.
and Stoicism is a Greek philosophy. Although, of course, Epictetus was a Greek who lived in Rome, so he's thought of as one of the Roman Stoics. But in any event, it's difficult to look at these things independently because of how interconnected every part of the philosophy is with every other part. And what you've made me think of when talking about the dichotomy of control and what we're able to do is the idea of roles, what we're able to control and what we're not able to control, what we need to accept. Is the idea of roles and the idea of fate and determinism, what some people call compatibilism or compatibilism and soft determinism. Um, I think a lot of people today don't know how to identify what their roles are and don't talk about roles enough. And I think this really crosses over with personal responsibility, like you were saying. So the Stoics tell us that every individual has assigned to them or self assigned roles. So, an example of a role that you self assign, you might be an activist of some kind. And so you take it on as a role and responsibility that you have to, march or hold a sign or advocate for a position. And if that's the role you've assigned yourself, then you should take that role seriously. There are also roles that are assigned to us through the results of our actions. So, for example, you might have a wife or a husband, and you fool around, and there's now a child. So your actions have resulted in the role of father or mother, and that role should be approached just as morally and appropriately as a role you would assign yourself. And then there are roles that are assigned by, I'll say, the cosmopolis, and I'll explain that in a second. But there are roles that are assigned by government. So you're a taxpayer is a role, depending on what country you're in. Maybe there are some countries where there are not taxpayers. I am not fortunate enough to be in one of them. And there are also roles that are assigned by your job. So you're an employee. Maybe you're a fry cook like SpongeBob SquarePants, and you have to take that very seriously. And that, going back to your original question about the differences in modern philosophy versus very traditional Western philosophy, and I said one was rights based and one was virtue ethics based or virtue based. In Stoicism, the most important thing you can do is develop a good character, a virtuous character, because if you do that, all the decisions you make, all the actions you take, all the thoughts you have, these are appropriate, they're moral, they're never inappropriate, they're never immoral. But with more continental philosophies and the ones that we see a lot in, especially in the educational system, and the ones I think you're getting at when you ask me this question, is that they're more rights based. It's more important for us to have the right to XYZ, and we can build a philosophy around the right to anything. I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular. But the thing is, with a rights-based ethics framework, it requires the actions of others to give you the things you need to live what will be defined in that sort of framework as a flourishing life. Whereas in Stoicism, and any virtue ethics based framework would be, and that would include cynicism, for example, capital C cynicism. The only way to make yourself flourish, the only way to have a flourishing life is to do it for yourself by developing a virtuous character. And so Stoicism, I think, is compared so frequently to Buddhism because Stoicism and Buddhism do something kind of similar in that they say it's not, and they both say this, it's not, there's not a problem with the world. There's a problem with how you view the world. Now, before anybody jumps on me for saying that, while that is what both say, Stoicism is also, I don't know about Buddhism. You'd have to talk to Emma Varvaloucas, one of our co-hosts on the show, about Buddhism, because I don't know that much about it. But in Stoicism, yes, it's true that the external world cannot define who you are, that you can define who you are yourself, we're excluding the idea of roles and such. That doesn't mean that Stoics don't do things to make the world a better place. And that's the part that a lot of people miss, is that Stoics don't care. They're detached. If I can't control it, it's not my concern. Well, if it's your role, it is your concern. And Stoics would argue that as a, I don't know what a controversial issue is. I try not to watch too much news, but I'm sure there's some controversial issue I could name that I'm not going to. But any controversial issue, a Stoic might argue that any virtuous person with the role of citizen, of the cosmopolis, and I told you I would come back to that, and I will, that we have to fix problems. The primary difference between cynicism, capital C, and Stoicism, capital S, is the degree to which we are called to participate in culture and in our societies. And so whatever problem that might arise inside of a society, Stoicism would say, you cannot control whether or not that problem exists. But that doesn't let you off the hook, because if it's a real problem and it's negatively impacting people's lives and you feel that it's not appropriate or it's immoral, then you need to come forward as someone who's attempting to develop virtue, and you need to do something about it. Otherwise, you're being a bad Stoic. And a lot of people don't understand that, because some of that stuff, I said they talk a lot about ethics, but some of what I'm talking about now is tied into their physics scheme, their cosmology, and also their the way they approach logic. And I'll touch on cosmopolitanism now. The Stoics believe that we're part of a world city, and a lot of people might hear that and think, "Oh, so the Stoics believe in the New World Order," like that kind of thing. But it's the idea that we're all living on the same planet, and if you want to envision the planet as a city, that's not a completely insensible thing to do, right? We all live in one place, address Earth, one Earth. That's where we live. And the Stoics look at that as we have a responsibility to ourselves. They didn't call it the circles of concern, but it's become known today as the circles of concern. And at the center of those circles of concern is you, the individual. And then you have family, and then friends, and then community. And then recently added on is biosphere, or non-human animals, and so on and so forth. And the idea of the circles of concern is that you are tasked as a Stoic, I would venture to say as a true Stoic, not one that thinks Stoicism is all about, only repressing not only, but repressing emotions at all, which is not what Stoicism is about. That we're tasked as Stoics to bring every concentric circle one bit closer to us. So we really can't make our family ourselves, but they're our family. That's the next closest circle outside of the self. And then we have friends. We want to make our friends more like our family. We want to bring them closer to us, and we need to care about them. We need to circle of concern. It's in the name. We need to have concern for them. Our community and our friends, we want to bring them into the circle of family so that we care about them the way we care about family, and so on and so forth. And I say that, I haven't said this too many times, but I like to say that we reach a kind of value singularity where if we do this perfectly, which of course no one does perfectly and no one probably has ever done except the sage, I don't know any, that we think of this kind of value singularity where everything has the same value to us, whether that's the earth, animals, our family, friends, communities, ourselves. We hold everything as one, and that really leans into Stoic cosmology, which really buys into the idea that we are all one. And I can go into that, but I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily what your audience wants, but it's there if you want to dive into it.
Yeah, and I touch on that too. It's a very interesting concept, and again, I would agree with you. I think sometimes misunderstood in many ways. I'd like to get into okay, well, let me back up a second. You mentioned rights-based ethics, which is what I would say what our laws are based on for the most part. And we can use maybe the American Constitution as the shining example of this. We have something similar in Canada, which name I will not utter here, but we do have something similar. But let's use the American Constitution because I think it's a more
If
sound
you're not
document.
uttering it, I'm worried how great it is. You're not going to say it.
Well, it could have been written in the language of Mordor. So,
Okay.
Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's the name is not nearly as sexy, but it's very similar in many ways. I think in many ways the Stoic role you mentioned building a better world, and I think obviously that's a very central element of Stoic philosophy. But would you say that part of what that means is building that rights based ethics such as law to create that society. And the point I want to make here is that we're separating these, but I think there's a deep connection that one naturally leads into the other.
Yes. Although I think it probably bears saying that Zeno, at least when he wrote Zeno's Republic, which is not, for anybody listening, Plato's Republic, it's a totally different work. Zeno is considered in ancient terms, not in modern terms, to be a what do you call it when you don't want any laws or government? What is that called? I'm blanking on the word.
Anarchist?
He's an anarchist. He is his idea of a perfect city is one, or a perfect cosmopolis in our case, is one without laws, one without schools, one without the institution of marriage. Now, of course, when he wrote this, although we only have fragments of it left, and I've not read them all, the idea was probably present in his mind. I can't speak for Zeno, but I'm sure very reasonable guy probably knew that this was an ideal and not something that was likely to be actually possible. But just like Plato wrote the Republic and Zeno wrote his Republic, we are envisioning what might be a perfect society, not necessarily saying that that's what we have to have. So I think that we can have rights, and I hope I haven't suggested that rights do not have value. I think that if you're someone who, as I said, is tasked with making the cosmopolis a better place, you eventually land at a place where there should be certain things in place to protect people from physical harm. But again, the ancient Stoics would say, well, your body's not your own, and you don't necessarily have control over that. And you shouldn't be doing vicious things to avoid being hurt. Although the creating of laws, not a vicious thing. I mean, it could be. You could make a vicious law, that's for sure. Laws aren't good just because they're laws. But I agree. I think we can have virtue be the encompassing framework of something that includes rights. But the idea of virtue ethics, as I understand it, and like I said, I'm a high school dropout. I'm no doctor of philosophy. Although maybe one day, who knows? Hopefully so. Um, but the thing that is leading most decisions and self guidance is virtue, not I have a right to this. It's how can I, even though I feel I might have a right to this, how am I allowing this lack of this right to take away from my eudaimonia, from my flourishing life? And we have it a little flipped. People are like, yeah, virtue's fine, but I want to get the rights first. They have the cart a little bit before the horse, and I don't think that they have it that way for inauthentic or you know evil reasons or maybe misled reasons. But I don't think anybody who's ever tried to get a law passed for anything And we can take, here in the States, we have, it's in the classroom. It's, oh, I can't remember what it's called. It's teaching, critical race theory. We have that here in the States. And I don't think anyone who came up with critical race theory had a bad idea in their head. I thought that I think that they were probably trying to help and benefit. But you can see how that's a little backwards, because I think it's less important to create a world that is perfect than it is to teach someone, and I think the Stoics think this as well, than it is to teach someone how to endure and flourish in a world that isn't perfect. Because just like Zeno's utopian chaos, a perfect city was never going to exist. He knew that, and Stoicism isn't some utopian view of how the world should be. It's a very contextual driven and very practical driven philosophy that says this is the way the world is. Who are you? What are your roles? What can you do to behave virtuously and make the cosmopolis a better place in your own way?
Yeah, love it, man. Very well said. And this is just as an example where this can get confusing. If a Stoic is slapped, they would use Stoicism in a way to say, well, that didn't harm my moral character, therefore I am not harmed. But they would also likely fight for laws that would say that's probably not a good thing. Probably shouldn't go around slapping each other. It's this idea that Marcus Aurelius talks about, and I can't remember the exact quote. Maybe you'll remember it, but it's something like, expect much of yourself and expect very little from others. Sort of this idea of holding yourself to a very high expectation. So I think people hear that and they get a little confused because they think, well, if everything external that happens to you isn't indifferent, well, then why should we create a better world in the first place? And I think that's just a false understanding of what the Stoics really say. It's like this idea of taking agency and understanding that your perceptions form your reality in many ways, that you have to hold, but you also have to understand that there's the cardinal virtue of justice, which includes that social obligation to make the world a better place. And even though you might not get harmed by being slapped, you still wouldn't propose that we create a world where everyone just goes around slapping each other all the time.
Right. There is a difference between saying slapping doesn't hurt you in the Stoic sense, and I don't care if you get slapped. Those are two different statements. And I don't care if there's someone around going on a slapping spree all over town. Replace slap with whatever violent thing you would like. But yeah, that's exactly right. There's how we deal with ourselves. There's how we deal with others, and how we're called to deal with the cosmopolis as a whole. You can call it the trichotomy of dealing, which I've just made up. Please don't use that anywhere.
Right, right. Part of what worries me about our discussion so far is that we have some agreement that I suppose that Stoics move the world towards a better place, and part of that includes creating rights-based ethics. But then the question becomes, does a society that has rights-based ethics over the generations create a society where virtue ethics are no longer valued? And maybe that's the point that we're at right now, where you and I are thinking, well, obviously virtue is the only good, but everyone else is saying, no, 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 no. You need to provide me everything I need to be happy. It's like this externalization of flourishing. It's like you're giving your power away. You and I see it that way. They don't see it like that. They see it as, no, 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 I deserve this.
Yeah, it's hugely problematic, because if you go too far in that direction, you wind up having to do some pretty negative things to some people, right? Some very unstoic things to some people. If your idea of the perfect society is one where, here in the States, it's commonly referred to as a welfare state. I don't know how well circulated that term is. Like I told you, I don't watch too much news. But the idea that if your idea of a great society is one where you are provided for and cared for, and have everything you view everything you need to be happy as being an external that someone is tasked to give you, well, there can become a problem where if people who disagree with that, just like in any direction, right? I'm not picking on any one political affiliation or the other, but if you're too far on one side, you eventually get so far to that side that the people who disagree with you on the other side, quote unquote, can no longer be tolerated. And if that's towards the direction that we're talking about, if that's towards the government has to provide everything for us, and that's the only way we can be happy is if we make this much money. I can't be happy unless I make $100,000 a year. Okay, well, money doesn't make you happy, and we're supposed to know that, right? But money does make feeding yourself possible, and that's important. And let's not dismiss that, right? But there's an increasing lack of balance as we age as a species. I think that is really putting us quite out of whack. But if you go too far in that direction, then you have a society that is completely reliant upon, we'll say government, but I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a government. It could be a military, it could be a monarchy, it could be anything, and that puts the individual in a very compromised position. Should those powers that now give you everything become powers that are not virtuous, right? Because an unvirtuous leader is a tyrant. And anyone who spends, I mean, really any good amount of time studying Stoicism, you will know why the sage is so rare. Accomplishing virtue, being a virtuous person it is amazing to me that Cleanthes ever had a job, right?
Mm.
Like, how can you be spending time thinking about these things, putting all this effort into developing a virtuous character, a good character in that sense, and still have time to like show up to your 9 to 5? Creating a virtuous character is probably the most difficult thing anyone can do. And anyone who's ever attempted to seriously to do so, or is in the process of doing so, how many times a day, maybe an hour, you fail to do it. You think vicious things all the time, and then you catch yourself and you correct, but you still do those vicious things. And the idea that we would ever have a government of people or an army of people or a collection of people who we are completely reliant on who would be sages, I mean, that's not a great position to put oneself in, I don't think. I think it's better to turn it around and put the onus on every individual to find a way to be content with what they have, even if what they have is not a lot, but not to use that as an excuse to say, you know what, you're complaining about only making $10,000 a year. If you were only more stoic, you would be able to deal with that. That's not stoicism. Part of it is that you don't have everything, and you need to learn how to still be a virtuous and decent character, even though you don't have everything. But you're also, as a Stoic, called, those who can and those who have the role, to do something to make life, the living conditions in life, better for other people. And so Stoicism really is highly contextual, as I said before, very role based, and it's extremely nuanced. Anybody who thinks they have a good understanding of Stoicism, I would challenge them to explain it in 30 minutes, and they'd probably still fail to do it.
Yeah, Stoicism is like hobbits, as Gandalf would say.
It's
He's
like
like,
hobbits.
you,
Oh, I
you,
see. I see. Yes, I
you
get it
can,
now.
yeah, I know you get it, but I'm going to explain it. You can learn everything about them and their culture and their ways of life in about 5 minutes, but after 100 years, you can still learn something new.
Yep.
And I think a lot of things are like that, but certainly that's been my my experience with Stoicism. It's like, God, you can learn it. It's like, oh, I get it. And then you talk to someone who's been practicing it for 20 years, and they're like, no, you get some of it, right?
I think it's probably also worth mentioning why people are more. It is easier to talk to somebody about rights than it is to talk to somebody about virtue. Part of that is just because we don't talk about virtue anymore. I mean, I didn't learn about virtue when I was in school, uh, and I said, like I said, I'm a dropout, but I feel like something as important as virtue should have been mentioned far earlier than I dropped out of school. And of course, I went on to further education later. But the fact is, I am a high school dropout, and at no point in my high school, middle school, or elementary career, as it were, did I hear anything about virtue? So that is part of the problem. Another consideration is that rights prevent suffering, right? So risk avoidance, or rather pain avoidance, really leans into demanding rights. I don't want this to happen to me, so I want a right that protects it from happening to me, which is not an unnatural thing to want, but it has become the priority over building the virtuous character. And virtue ethics are, I mean, they're a little bit on the rise at this point because Stoicism is having, I wouldn't necessarily call it a renaissance, but something like that. People have renewed interest in it, mostly through life hacks and individuals like Ryan Holiday, and not scholarly sources, for example. Um, and I'm actually hoping to change that with my new book, which I should have mentioned earlier, but it's called Stoicism But Brief, and it's coming out in a couple months.
Nice.
If anybody wanted to learn more about that, they can go to stoicismpod.com/brief, BRIEF as in short. And you can read a little bit about it and put your name on the alert list if you want to know when it comes out. I'm trying to write something that is accessible, brief, and accurate. And there's not a lot of that. So part of it is that it's easy to lean into rights-based philosophies and ethics specifically, because it says I'm going to make life suck less for you, right? And who doesn't want
Mhm.
life to suck less? I mean,
Yeah.
I know I've had a lot of nights and months and years where I've eaten nothing but noodles, and I would have loved to have had something more, more filling or more worthwhile than noodles. So I get it. And then the other problem is that we don't even talk about virtue. We don't even talk about philosophy. I mean, I feel like people don't discuss philosophy until 11th or 12th grade, and then it's very rudimentary. It's very basic, at least here in the States. I don't know how it is in Canada. And we don't talk about ethics. And if you're going to study philosophy, I mean, you're going to do it as a minor or a major in college. And by that time, for goodness sake, you're an adult. You've been making all kinds of vicious decisions that perhaps you would not have made if someone talked to you about the virtues of a good character early on. And I talk about this a lot, but when I was a kid, growing up in New Hampshire, which for those of you who don't live in the States, it's in New England, in the northeast part of the country. And um, I remember there was this series of books called Value Tales, and they were 20-page full color cartoony type books, and everyone was like, the value of honesty, the value of virtue, the value of hard work. And they weren't I went back and read a few of them recently. They weren't overly political. They weren't political at all, in fact, I don't think. They were just good, clean, great advice for someone who wanted to raise a kid that had a good character. It's important to work hard. It's important to care about others. It's important to try new things and to put yourself at risk if you think you can benefit. It's important to be generous. I mean, I couldn't even imagine that book being read in a modern school. I'm going to call it a schoolhouse just to really make myself feel old. uh, I couldn't even imagine a book like that being written, let alone read, in elementary school. I think I was in second grade when those books came out, and I remember I was in second grade because I remember that classroom, and that schoolhouse only had 3 classrooms to really let you know how old I am and how small that town was. So yeah, we don't teach it, we don't talk about it, and we teach everybody that they're owed things, and that the big issue here is that we convey the idea that the secret to happiness lies in what other people can give you. And that is not true. And it's a really dangerous kind of like medicine drip to get people on, because they just keep needing more externals and more things that they can't provide for themselves, that someone has to give them. And that is not a way to develop a flourishing life or a virtuous character, in my opinion, and in the Stoics' opinion.
Yeah, and I would wholeheartedly agree. I think part of the reason for that is we are moving away from nature, and I'm using that word very, very selectively, let's say. But I grew up. I don't know if I mentioned this the last time we spoke, but I grew up on a fishing boat, and I don't mean, I say that a lot. I don't mean literally on a fishing boat. I mean I fished. My dad was a fisherman. I grew up in a house like a normal kid, but I went fishing from time to time with the old man, and so we had to deal with like the weather, and we had to deal with uh, well, we're living right on the ocean, right? So there's this humbling element, I think, to the natural world. And part of me thinks that when you put people in a city where you don't see where the water comes from. I mean, we had a well. Like I knew exactly where the water came from. We would lose power for weeks at a time. There's nothing that can save you from the weather anywhere, but when you're right on the ocean, you're experiencing it daily, you're hearing it daily. And I think as we sort of move away from a lot of these foundational things, such as like where do you get your water? Where do you get your food? It's so easy to, I guess, get detached from some of the most really important things in life, which I think is the humbling elements of it. I think when you understand, let's say, for example, the work it takes to maintain the sewage systems, to get your food, to get your water, it's not just turn on a tap and that's where it comes from. It's like you're not seeing a lot of work that goes on underneath that. And I think part of the consequence of that is this feeling of entitlement. It's like, no, we just turn the water on. Like, no. You're not seeing that there's a lot of people that share in the cosmos that have that divine spark that are putting work in to get you that thing. You're completely detached from that side of it. And I think with that comes this move away from virtue and towards rights based. Uh, I shouldn't say towards rights based ethics. Let's say away from virtue ethics over time. A theory, I don't know if it's true or not, but I do feel in general that people that live in bigger cities, they tend to be a little bit less humble. They tend to be a bit more detached. They tend to be a bit more just up in the air about certain things. If you look at the extremes like California, for example.
I would say, having never been to California, so I actually can't speak to that. I would say that it's interesting, and I was thinking about it as you were saying what you just said, that a person who is salt of the earth, Kai Whiting and I were just talking about this the other day. It's strange that you brought it up. That they have fewer artificial, non-natural barriers between themselves and nature. And again, I don't want to dive into the Stoic cosmology, but there's an idea that virtue and all the various parts of what makes a person or an animal, that they are part of the cosmos, and those things do not exist in, or rather exist in a very inert form, the closer you get to a city. And I want to make sure I'm not stumbling over myself too badly here. When you have paved roads, lots of stores, regardless of what they are, high rise buildings, very manicured type trees, if there are any trees, you are in an interesting way segmented away from nature, literal nature. And I think that makes it hard to not be distracted to, you've probably used the terms prokopton and prosike, to pay attention, the act of paying attention. It's hard to do that when you have no nature around to remind you, other than perhaps people honking at you, and maybe that's enough to remind you that you have a nature as a human being that you are not serving. Instead, you're kind of, it's interesting because I think that a Stoic might, there are a lot of people who are drawn to Stoicism because it can seem conservative. It can seem, and I don't necessarily mean that in a political sense, but it seems like more grounded. And it does feel like the world's going a little nuts. And so I feel like a lot of the reason that a lot of my audience is, between 18 and 35 has something to do with, I might be one of the first people they've ever heard talking about grounded things that don't sound don't sound silly to them. And that might be because they live in environments where, there are advertisements and there are video games and there are high-rise buildings and there's keeping up with the Joneses culture, and there's money, 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 and music videos. And I really sound like an old man after having said music videos. I don't even think those exist anymore. And there's just nothing to, there's no break unless they create it for themselves in all of that distraction. That I don't really, when people act viciously, and I don't just mean this from a Stoic standpoint, although of course I also mean it from that standpoint, I don't blame them, because I don't think they know any better. I think that's probably the third part of the problem, is like, how do you expect anybody to have any time to reflect? They're busy all the time. And some of that leans into, I was going to say earlier that while I think this is a very conservative, and I might mean that politically in this sense, that is a conservatively attractive, or attractive to conservatives as a philosophy. I don't know how ancient Stoics would feel about this kind of endless capitalism. I think they'd probably not like it too much. I think they'd like capitalism, but then they'd see what it became and they'd be like, I don't know. I think we got to scale that back, everybody. And I think that the more that there's a certain kind of person that comes to Stoicism for a certain reason, self-reliance, get tough, have a tough mind kind of reasons. And if those people dug deeper, I think they would either run from Stoicism because it would really push them to question their own cognitive dissonance about certain things. When I talked about membership in a cosmopolis, I mean, there are people who would think that sounds socialistic. They would be like, that's socialism. We're not all part of one city. That's the New World Order. Like, there are people who think like that. Um, but it's also one of the reasons that I'm writing the book is I feel like, look, if you're interested in Stoicism, I want you to know that now with a full and complete view of what it is before you get 3 years into this thinking that Stoicism is all about just remembering you're going to die and then poisoning the well of information to everybody you talk to about what Stoicism is. Because it is it's a full life philosophy. And for people who want it to be, it's not exactly a religion. I don't think it would qualify from our modern definition of religion, but I do think that it has a religiosity to it, a sort of commitment necessary to practice it well. And I think some people, if they push past the memento mori and all, having a coin with a skull on it and all those things, which serve their purpose, I think that they would find more, and they would be glad they found it. And I wish more people would do that. I feel like everybody needs Stoicism, man. I keep saying that it won't work for everybody because it won't be, people won't bring it on as their role. It's not, it might not work for everyone, but I think virtue ethics are for everyone. So maybe it's Platonism, Neoplatonism. Maybe that's what it is for you. But I don't think it's anything else that we're trying currently. And that's a bummer because there's a lot of problems in the world. And if we were all on board with Stoicism, I think we'd all be doing a lot more to work towards solutions for them.
Yeah, I would agree, man. Very well said. And I would say, in many ways, it's kind of like being handed a pizza, like everything on it, right? Peppers, onions, sausage, everything on it. And that's like the Stoic pizza. And some people think that you can kind of pick out the onions and pick out the mushrooms and pick out this and pick out that. And some people do that and then they sell it in a book. But the flavor is still going to be in there a little bit. So you can't completely get rid of the ingredients. But it's still not as good as having everything in that pizza. And the real question I think that we as modern Stoics or contemporary Stoics have to ask ourselves is, like, how much of that do we want to get rid of, and how much of that can we get rid of? And is it still the same damn pizza if we get rid of half the ingredients? I hope the pizza analogy is sticking, pardon the pun, but I think it was important. And the last little thing I would like to say is that I think, you and I, we could talk for hours and hours and hours and weeks and months about what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a person of virtue. But I think sometimes even that's overcomplicated. I mean, you and we enjoy doing this. We enjoy these discussions. But I always remember back to my old man, he would say, just be a good person. Most people have a decent idea of what that means. And yeah, we can get bogged down with details and this and that. Most people, if you say, just be a good person, just go out there into the world and try to be a good person. Even if you just take that advice, like, just imagine how different things would be if everyone even if we didn't even define it. Because I think for the most part, we have some innate morality, some idea of what is right, what is wrong. And it's not perfect. We all know that. But I think it's close enough at least to at least get people interested and maybe move towards something better.
I think a key to that happening, and I think about this a lot because I don't have kids, and I've wondered if maybe if that's a mistake. I don't know, but the I I think you're right that if you were to tell most people, let's say our age, to be a good person, that we have a fairly decent idea of what that means. Now, we wouldn't know anything about Stoic roles or role based ethics or anything like that. but we'd be like, okay, yeah, you hold the door for the person behind you, you don't litter. If you see a piece of trash on the street, maybe you pick it up and throw it in the next bin because you're going to be walking by one in 30 seconds anyway. Like I think all of us kind of get that. But I also think that people your age and my age grew up with parents that instilled those things in us at a young age. And I don't, not to take a swipe at contemporary parents. I mean, I'm sure there are still parents like that. But I think all of us, as at least in my age bracket, we can hear young kids talk to their parents in ways, and we will often say, if I had spoken to my father like that, he would have killed me. And it's not literally, it's not literal, but it's pretty close. Like there would have been a pretty severe punishment for telling your dad to go F himself or something. That would not have been met with patience or gentle parenting. And so I think that part of what you've just said, I think, is correct. But I think part of making sure that it's sustainable, that we can even tell someone to be a good person, is that people have to start explaining what that means. When your kid, who, maybe your kid is 6 years old and they notice that you constantly hold the door for people, and then one day you're leaving a restaurant and they hold the door for whoever happens to be behind them, and you make a big deal about that. You say, "Oh, that was so nice. That elderly man, he had a walker, and he probably wasn't going to be able to hold the door himself, and you just did a really great thing." And if you praise that kind of behavior, I think that is what results in this knowing that people our age have about what it means to be quote unquote a good person. Because you think back to, well, it's all the things my mom and my grandma told me. But are people still saying that as much as they used to? It's certainly not being taught in schools as much as it used to. Going back to that value tale story, and I think that's part of the problem, and it's also part of the solution. We should start talking about these things. Your goal is not to make money and be successful and own a tech startup. All those things are great. I owned a tech startup, so like I'm involved in a tech startup right now, based in the AI space. So it's not that those things are not okay. It's not that you can't look at those things and want to become something. You can, but the first thing you should want to become is a good person. And if you have anything before that, you have got the cart really inappropriately before the horse, and it's not going to go well for you, probably, but also for the rest of the world, which is our cosmopolis, and we should be concerned about that.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I'm glad you said that because I do think that socialization does play a huge role in our value system and who we are and who we become. And I think part of the problem is that this isn't going to make me popular, but I think in many ways we overvalue, maybe in part due to a misunderstanding of what it means to be kind to one another. There's this idea in the West now that we just accept every walk of life. And that sounds like a very nice romantic idea, but I think it's deeply misinformed. And I think just to give a simple example, that's not so simple, but there are people that think that they are actually another animal. And you can look at that and you can say, well, be a good person, be kind, and accept them for who they are and just play into their narcissism or whatever it is. And you could say that. Stoics would say, but it's not true. It's not true. You have a subjective reality and you can change that, but it has to be aligned with Mother Nature. It has to be aligned with objective reality. And so I would agree, and I'm glad you pointed that out because I think that's really important. That yeah, we all got this innate, I think, idea of what it means to be a good person, but I think it's also very nuanced, and I think it can be changed quite significantly by society, by culture.
And I think what you're doing there is you said animals because you didn't want to talk about gender, but I think
We
because
could we could talk about gender.
everybody knows what we're talking about, so I think we should just say it. I'll be honest that I'm not entirely sure about the Stoic position on that, because of course the Stoics um, would not have even had that to think about, in as far as I understand history. Um, my suspicion is that there's some amount of another person's identity, in whatever kind we're talking about, isn't indifferent to you and should not affect your ability to build towards virtue and to hopefully one day become the sage, if you're so lucky. But you, but you need to consider your behavior towards those individuals and whether or not that behavior is virtuous. So you talked about we have to be nice to people, we have to be kind to people, and it is true that there's, at least in my opinion, it's true. So it's subjectively true that there are being nice to someone is not necessarily the same as being kind to someone.
Mm.
Sometimes somebody needs a kick in the ass, metaphorically speaking, maybe literally, and that's not particularly nice. And so, one that I constantly talk about or have talked about in the past is if you have a very overweight friend and your friend wants to go out to eat and they want to go to McDonald's. Well, you have a decision to make there as their friend, which means something very special and specific in Stoicism. If they're your friend, going back to those circles of concerns and thinking about that, um, do you want to express behavior that is participating in another person's damaging of their health or damaging of their own virtue? And those are not easy thoughts to get through. Like I said, as far as the trans community is concerned, or any identity based discussion that we could have, and I think we could have a few of them, right up to and including political identities. Uh, I I don't have a lot of really firm positions on it, other than I think what's important is to be honest as an individual, and is to try to do no harm, right? As Stoics were called to benefit the cosmopolis, not hurt it. But sometimes those things can seem like they're in contention with one another, right? We have people who identify as a gender that some of us might argue with. And so, what do we do about that? Do we make a law that makes it impossible for them to live the way they feel that they should be able to? Is that the right thing to do? Do we not use their specific what do they call do we not use their specific pronouns because we don't think they deserve that? um, it's not easy to think about, and I think unfortunately that every time this conversation comes up with anybody, this is probably only one of the first times I've spoken about it publicly, there are assumptions on both sides that are just immediate, and it's very hard to get someone from the trans community into a room with someone from any community that's not sympathetic, and try to have a rational discourse about why the person on one side feels one way and how the person on the other side disagrees and what they feel. And it's a very difficult place to do out loud thinking, which I think is making it worse, because if there's no outside public thinking going on, then the only thing that you have to go on is suppositions that you have, not you specifically, but anyone has of the opposing side. And then it all just becomes a caricature of itself. Nobody has a mature discussion and no real answers are come to. And I don't know. I mean, I know that uh, homosexuality in ancient Greece was not illegal, nor was it uncommon. In fact, Marcus Aurelius talks about this in one of his early books, where he talks about being grateful that he never took. He says he never took a male partner because I can't remember his exact wording, but it was a very common thing to happen in ancient Greece. And so I wonder, transgenderism could have been a thing that happened in ancient Greece, and how would they have thought of it? I mean, they didn't kill people for sleeping with young boys if they were men. So what would they have done about this? It's hard to think about. It's challenging, but I also think it's something we should talk about, because the Stoics have to have a position on it in some way, right? We have to be honest, and we have to have a position. We have to think about it logically, and maybe the answer we come to is not one anybody likes. But again, Stoicism is highly contextual, and it's going to depend on who you are, how you feel about it, because Stoicism does not tell you how to feel or think about things. It tells you to do what is appropriate for your responsibilities and your roles and your duty to the cosmopolis. And what is and isn't virtuous. Those are the only rules it gives you, and the rest of it is up to you, which is one of the things that makes it hard.
It is. It's a very complicated matter. And I think, to me, if you say love for humanity, love for you, love for me, whatever, really what you mean is, I want you to flourish. And part of what that means, if again you take the Stoic belief, is I want you to live a life of virtue. And part of what that means is living in accordance with nature at all levels of analysis. And so I think the perspective is not, it's not one of hate or anything like that. It's just one of, I don't think by my belief system, and maybe my belief system is wrong, but I don't think you can flourish unless you align yourself with objective reality. That being said, I'll be polite. I'll use your pronouns i- in a social situation. I'm not going to try and embarrass you in a public setting because that would just be rude. But if we're having a debate about something, if we're talking about if a man can in fact be a woman, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to speak truth as I see it. Maybe my truth is not right. Maybe you can prove me wrong. And so I think at the end of the day, it brings back to how Kai actually puts a lot of this stuff. It's like, is it appropriate? Like, is it appropriate when you're at a party and there's a few trans people there to make a speech about how that's not true and they're living in a lie? Of course not. Nobody, no Stoic would ever do that. Is it appropriate if you're having an honest debate and a mutually agreed upon debate where you're both voluntarily engaging into this process to figure out the truth? Is it appropriate to speak the truth as you see it? And maybe you're flawed in your thinking, but at least that's how you find the truth, through dialogue. Of course it's appropriate. So it is touchy, it is complicated, but I agree. I think we need to talk about this. I think we have to trust in logos, which is, listen, man, I'm going to be wrong a lot. You're going to be wrong a lot. Maybe if we talk to each other, we can figure out what's right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And to go back to something you said about flourishing, the Stoics actually do hold the position that there are some people who who are not capable of flourishing, or not capable of developing virtue because they don't have. And I'm not suggesting this of anyone in the trans community specifically. I'm just saying it because of something you said about allowing wanting a person to flourish. Some people can't flourish because they lack the uh, mental capacity, or let's say that makes it sound like it's about whether or not they're smart. I mean, whether or not they lack the faculties, the strength of faculty that um, to actually make informed decisions, appropriate decisions, to reason through those things. And if they can't, then they can't develop virtue. And so Kai Whiting is somebody who talks about, for example, certain mental disabilities or conditions like bipolar disorder. If you're bipolar and you're unmedicated, you cannot develop virtue. It's not possible for you to do because your brain is not functioning properly. And so the Stoics do say that there are some people who cannot develop a flourishing life, and they actually say that we should care more about them than we're not to dismiss them out of hand for society, or feel pity for them, but we are supposed to feel sympathy for them, and we should want to do something to make their life as flourishing like as it can be, since they can't do it for themselves. And again, that is not a comment to this terrible timing, but it's not a comment about the trans community. It's just a comment about the truth that there are some people, according to the Stoics, who can't develop or can't reach eudaimonia.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things I think presumably you love about Kai, and something I love about Kai. He's not afraid of those difficult topics. He dives right into it, and I think I see that courage in you too. So that's very. I love to see that, and I hope I share in that sentiment. That was beautiful. I'm going to give you, I guess, a chance to say any final words that you have. Maybe a great ending question would be, how do we go back? How do we go back, or rather, maybe a better way of saying it is, how do we move forward using these virtue ethics, or even finding the value in it? I mean, you mentioned that our generation, yeah, we kind of grew up with some of this distilled into us. Maybe the younger generation is not getting that as much. But what's the solution here?
Well, I think first, remember that you have, not you specifically, you, the royal you, we have a responsibility to effort, to try. We have to try. It's a duty to our cosmopolis, and we should take it seriously. We should try to act appropriately and morally while trying to take it seriously. We have to make the effort. We, as people who are cognitively able to do so, we have to do it. Now, what that is specifically, we have to figure out on our own. What are our roles, and how can we play them morally and appropriately? And then, in addition to that, if you have kids, I think it's probably appropriate for your role as a parent to um, to instill in them an understanding of the importance of being a good person. You wouldn't say virtue to a 6-year-old, but you would say be a good person, because a 6-year-old can understand that. And the Stoics, in fact, say not to teach Stoicism or philosophy in general to anybody who's under the age of, between 14 and 16, so somewhere around there. It's kind of contextual based on the individual, but we're not to indoctrinate our children in an aggressive way. We're instead supposed to make these light suggestions, like be a good person. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means things like, if you see trash in the ground, pick it up. And if there's somebody's behind you, hold the door. And when somebody does something nice for you, say thank you. And if you get a Christmas present, write a thank you letter, something like that. And to try to kickstart the process of being a good person, succeeding or failing at doing that, is actually something that I might be judged for. My mom is going to be proud of me, or my dad's going to be proud of me if I'm a good person. They won't be proud of me if I'm a misbehaved or less than good person, or let's say vicious person. Everybody's less than good in the Stoic sense. So I think that's another part of it. And not giving up. I think we're going to be here for thousands of more years, not you and I, obviously, but don't get hopeless. We can't control the future, but we can, as little decision-making machines in the fabric of the cosmos, we can help to influence it. And we are called by Stoicism to attempt to influence it by using our rational minds to make virtuous, appropriate decisions. So that's all I've got, man.
I love it, man. I love it. You reminded me of a quote there right at the end, which can't be taken for every situation, but when we're talking about Stoicism in a world where maybe we're not valuing Stoicism so much, there's a lyric that says, "Never give up whether anyone cares or not." And I think that's something that I have to remind myself of sometimes. It's like Marcus Aurelius was saying, not everyone's going to give a shit about this stuff, but you can choose to give a shit about this stuff. Tanner, thank you so much for being here. That was a beautiful conversation. Loved it. Learned a lot as well. I'm going to give you a chance. Where can people find you if they're not already listening to you? Where would you send people to?
You can find my podcast at stoicismpod.com, or you can just search for Practical Stoicism in your podcast player of choice, and you'll find me right away. And if you're interested in the book that I'm writing, Stoicism But Brief, you can find that at stoicismpod.com/brief. Please check that out. Put your name on the list. I'll let you know the moment it comes out. And if you want to follow me on social or our YouTube channel, you can find me at No Sages on YouTube. We do what we call mini mentories every month. We try to do it every month. It takes a lot of work. They're 10 minutes long, but man, video is a whole other beast. And I'm on Twitter, but barely, at Stoicism Tanner. I just got on Twitter. I'm very excited about that. So maybe I'll have a blue check soon. I have to give Elon my money.
Twitter, the land of opportunity.
Yeah, right.
You'll be great there. All right, man. I appreciate you. Cheers. Until next time. Thanks again.
Take care.